Spring, 1220. On the ragged edge of old Khorasan, a mother stood helplessly while soldiers pulled her 14-year-old daughter toward a prisoner caravan. The girl didn't scream. She'd already understood that fighting back would only make what came next worse. Her name was Zarya. The Mongol clerks had it written down before the dust even settled. Age, build, hair, skin, any mark that might matter. Everything about her was logged with the cold neatness of an empire that was still growing and already sure it would keep growing. What happened to girls like Zarya wasn't random cruelty. It was policy. The Mongols weren't only trying to break cities or seize land. They were trying to control people, down to the future. Women's bodies were folded into a bigger imperial logic where motherhood became a political resource. None of this shows up cleanly in the official chronicles. The scribes who praised victories didn't want to describe the machinery behind them. But the effects spread anyway, not just through memory and culture, but through bloodlines. This wasn't only military conquest. It was biological and social integration on purpose. And what began in those prisoner caravans explains why, centuries later, genetic studies would find echoes of that system in millions of people alive today. Because the real power of Genghis Khan wasn't just in how far his armies rode. It was in the human legacy those armies produced, managed with a brutal efficiency no empire had ever used before. This is the story of how one man turned reproduction into part of his architecture of power, and why the shadow of that design still hangs over the present. To understand how he got there, we have to go back to the Mongolian steppe in 1162. A boy was born into a life where survival meant taking what someone else had. His name was Temüjin. He didn't come from a mighty clan. His people were poor, pushed to the margins, and constantly preyed on by stronger tribes. When Temüjin was 9, his father died, probably poisoned by enemies during one of the endless tribal feuds. Overnight, the family's protection vanished. Temüjin's mother, Hoelun, was abandoned with several small children and almost no support. The steppe doesn't do mercy. They ate roots. They ate raw fish. They ate whatever they could find that didn't find them first. That childhood carved a lesson into Temüjin early. The world was split into two kinds of people, those who take and those who get taken. By 16, he was promised to a girl named Berta. Then a rival tribe stormed in and kidnapped her. Temüjin spent months hunting for her, living on scraps of rumor. Some said she was being passed from man to man. Some said she'd been forced into another marriage. Some swore she was already dead. When he finally rescued her, she was alive and pregnant. Was the child his? Was it one of theirs? He never knew. But something snapped into focus for him that night. A hard, clinical understanding. Women weren't just spoils of war. They were the future. And whoever controlled that future controlled everything else. Temüjin didn't build his power only with warriors. He built it with that idea, an idea no one around him had ever fully articulated. He watched enemy camps mourn their dead for days. He saw defeated men kill themselves out of shame. But the women lived. They adapted. They bore children. And those children grew up remembering who had seized their mothers. Temüjin didn't see that as a danger. He saw an opening. If you could control reproduction in conquered peoples, you wouldn't need to hold a territory forever with garrisons. You could remake it from the inside. Children would grow up Mongol by blood, by language, by loyalty, and the old identity would wither in a single generation. So when, in 1206, the Mongol tribes raised Temüjin up as Great Khan and gave him the name Genghis Khan, he already had something in motion. Later administrators would call it the permanent sewing system. That sounds almost mystical, but it wasn't philosophy. It was protocol, a military method. And the first real test came fast. In 1209, Genghis Khan marched against the Tangut kingdom. The Mongols didn't arrive like a chaotic swarm. They arrived like a machine. With the cavalry came scribes, administrators, and physicians who understood female anatomy in practical, ruthless ways. Weeks before the siege, spies slipped into Tangut cities and built secret censuses. How many women were there? What ages? What physical traits? Which families? Which lineages? All of it was written onto parchment rolls. What might be the earliest industrial records of sexual violence in history? When the first Tangut city fell, the Mongols divided the population with surgical calm. Men were executed or enslaved. Women were sorted into reproductive classes. Primary reproducers, 14 to 30, no obvious deformities. Secondary reproducers, 31 to 40, proven mothers, still usable. Discard, under 14, over 40, sick, injured. The first two groups were marked with ink on the wrist and assigned to specialized caravans that followed behind the army. The third group vanished. No lists, no return. The system was terrifyingly efficient. These caravans weren't normal prisoner lines. They were mobile processing units, wagons built like rolling cages with internal divisions to separate women by status. New captives in one compartment, confirmed pregnancies in another, recent births in a third, unproductive women in a fourth, where elimination was carried out gradually, quietly, and without wasting resources on anyone who no longer served the plan. The Mongols even had medical practices built around this. Herbs to drive ovulation, diets meant to keep fertility high, crude procedures to correct problems that might block pregnancy. The women weren't treated as people. They were treated as reproductive livestock, maintained, measured, and used. And what made it worse than the violence itself, was the paperwork. Every assault was recorded, every pregnancy registered, every birth classified. The administrators developed number codes they tattooed onto women's wrists. Identity, tribal origin, reproductive history, estimated productive value. A captured woman lost her name that day. She became a unit in a statistical empire. Some tried to whisper their real names to their children before the children were taken. Some cut small scars into their own skin so they wouldn't forget who they had been. But the machinery didn't care. In less than a generation, thousands of women had been turned into ghosts of themselves. By 1211, when Genghis Khan moved against the Jin Empire in northern China, the process had been refined. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they conquered wombs. Records from the Chinese campaign are chilling. In one city alone, Zhongdu, they captured more than 40,000 women of reproductive age. By 1213, reports describe over 100,000 women moving in caravan networks stretching for hundreds of kilometers behind the main army. Women weren't being taken in ones and twos anymore. They were being processed in waves. Each caravan had sections for each stage: capture, classification, acclimation, a polite word for systematic assault, pregnancy, birth, and reassignment. Babies born into the system were inspected. Those with traits deemed Mongol enough were separated and raised by Mongol families. The others were killed immediately. No ceremony, no record beyond a checkmark. Resistance was expected, so the system had protocols for that too. Women who refused food were force-fed until they accepted their bodies weren't theirs anymore. Women who tried to end pregnancies were watched and bound in late months. Women who hurt themselves to avoid usefulness were kept alive long enough to be punished publicly as a warning. And those who killed their own newborns, desperate to keep them from being raised Mongol, were tortured in ways designed to turn maternal compassion into terror. Genghis Khan had created something that went beyond war, as anyone knew it. He wasn't satisfied with territory that might rebel later. He was engineering conquest into the bones of future generations. Every pregnant woman in those caravans was a seed planted for permanent rule. By 1220, the network was enormous. Mongol administrative records preserved in Chinese and Persian archives describe more than 200,000 women spread across routes running from Mongolia into Central Asia and toward Eastern Europe. The empire had built logistics specifically for transporting, feeding, controlling, and processing captives. There were resupply stations where doctors checked the units, mobile hospitals for forced births, classification hubs where each baby's fate was decided. The horror wasn't only the violence, it was the systemization. Evil turned into bureaucracy, brutality turned into routine. Scribes logged assaults with the same neatness they logged captured cattle. Doctors experimented with fertility like they experimented with battlefield tactics. Administrators calculated human production rates the way they counted stolen gold. And yet, even inside that machine, the women found ways to resist. Ways the Mongols couldn't fully record because they lived between the lines of bureaucracy. They passed information through gestures, escape plans, methods to induce miscarriage, ways to poison milk without leaving proof. Some weakened themselves quietly, vomiting food in secret until they were too frail to be useful. Others cut themselves where infections would bloom into fevers and complications. But the most painful resistance was emotional. They formed secret rituals to remember the names of dead children, to keep fragments of their old lives alive in whispered songs. They knew they might die in the caravans. Still, they fought to make sure something of who they were survived, if only as breath in the cold steppe night. And that brings us back to Zarya, walking in silence at the edge of Khorasan, entering a system that had already been perfected by a man who understood that conquest didn't end when the swords were sheathed. In 1219, the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire pushed that system into its most refined form. By then, the Mongols weren't improvising. They had procedures for different kinds of cities, different cultures, different patterns of resistance. What had started as brutal experimentation had hardened into doctrine. Before the main army even appeared on the horizon, intelligence teams had already been at work inside Khwarezmian territory. These weren't just scouts counting walls and wells. They cataloged women, yes, but also their families, their social standing, their skills, and the emotional ties that could be used to break them. Every detail was ammunition in a psychological war designed to make processing smoother and faster. So when the Mongols finally arrived, they didn't come only to loot. They came to harvest. Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv. City after city fell under the same cold rhythm. Women were pulled away from their families with industrial precision. By this point, the Mongols had learned exactly how long they could keep mothers near small children before moving them on. The first weeks of acclimation were easier if a woman believed her child was still close. But after about 3 months, separating them shattered something deeper. It broke the last thread of resistance. The system had learned that timeline like a surgeon learns where to cut. They also had different tracks for different classes. Women of the noble families were handled separately, not out of mercy, out of calculation. They were assigned to higher-ranking officers, placed in slightly better tents. given a thin layer of ceremony to disguise the same violence. Mongol administrators had noticed that children of noble women tended to show physical traits that made later integration into Mongol aristocracy easier. So these women were treated like high-value breeders. Peasants, by contrast, were processed in mass batches. Their value was simpler: physical stamina, the ability to survive pregnancy under marching, hunger, and terror. They were treated as durable stock, useful for volume rather than prestige. Mongol physicians sharpened their methods alongside the violence. They used herb mixtures meant to boost fertility and sometimes induce multiple ovulations. Twins and even triplets weren't accidents. They were outcomes to be encouraged. They'd learn to spot pregnancy early, then adjust diets to reduce complications and keep survival rates high. Every captured uterus was meant to become the most efficient factory possible. By 1220, the scale of it strains belief. Reports describe caravans stretching out beyond sight, packed so tightly that they became moving corridors of bodies. Days of marching, not a single break in the chain. Each caravan was divided into specialized sections like parts of a mobile city: capture intake, classification, acclimation, early pregnancy, late pregnancy, birth, post-birth care, reassignment or elimination. Each section had its own guards, scribes, and doctors, and each had its own fixed routines. The caravans traveled with wagon hospitals for forced deliveries, prison tents for each stage of pregnancy, even morgue wagons designed for clean, quiet disposal of women who died along the way. It was a city built for one purpose only: moving like a shadow behind the cavalry. And then there was the deeper idea underneath it all, the part Genghis Khan understood better than anyone else. Rape could be a moment, a terror, a wound in time. But genes were forever. Every child born in those caravans carried the conquest inside his blood. Those children would have children, and those children would have children. A single assault became a strand in a lineage that could last centuries. Violence turned into permanent victory, not through fear, but through inheritance. Modern genetics backs up how effective that grim logic was. Studies of the Y chromosome show that around 16 million men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan or his immediate male line. Think about that for a second. Roughly 1 out of every 200 men on Earth carries a marker that traces back to that imperial system. In Mongolia, the proportion is close to 8%. In Central Asia, around 3%. Even in Eastern Europe, where Mongol occupation was shorter, you still find those genetic signatures woven into whole populations. And that number doesn't even tell the full story. Because the system didn't end with Genghis Khan himself. His sons, his grandsons, his generals, all of them kept using the same protocols. Ogedei Khan refined them during the push into Europe. Mungke Khan applied them as the Mongols smashed through the Abbasid Caliphate. Kublai Khan used them in China. Over time, it was no longer just something Genghis did. It became imperial tradition, an operational manual passed like a crown. So when Genghis Khan died in 1227 during another campaign against the Tangut, the machine didn't stop. If anything, his death locked it in. The caravans by then stretched across Eurasia for thousands of kilometers. Women were redistributed among Mongol princes like inherited livestock. Babies born into the system were raised to become soldiers, administrators, and future commanders. The protocols Genghis had built were treated as part of his sacred legacy, essential to holding the empire together. Even his funeral reflected that logic. The visible ceremony was horrific enough. 40 young women were reportedly buried alive with his body to serve him in death. But that wasn't the true offering. The real sacrifice happened away from the songs and smoke. During the transition of power, thousands of women from the caravans were executed so they wouldn't escape in the confusion. Their graves weren't marked with honor. They were dumped into mass pits, organized with the same bureaucratic coldness that had defined the system in life. Archaeologists have begun finding those pits in recent years. Across former Mongol territories, excavation sites from the early 13th century keep revealing the same pattern. Large burial grounds filled with young women, set apart from the graves of warriors. Skeletons showing chronic malnutrition, untreated fractures, joint wear from forced transport. And beside them, the bones of infants and small children buried without the rituals Mongols normally used for their own dead. In one site near Old Bukhara, archaeologists uncovered something that circles us back to where this story began. Two bodies laid side by side, one adult woman and one teenage girl. DNA tests confirmed they were mother and daughter. Isotope analysis suggested the mother was local, but the girl had traveled far before she died. A mother and a daughter, together in death after being torn apart in life. It's hard not to imagine the scene that brought them there. Maybe a caravan, maybe a city that fell too quickly, maybe a choice between obedience and annihilation. But even without a perfect narrative, the evidence speaks. The system didn't just erase people in the moment. It scattered them across continents. It rewrote their family histories. It left mothers buried in foreign soil and daughters who never made it home. And that's the piece that still matters now. Because when we talk about Genghis Khan, most stories stop at the battles. The arrows, the sieges, the speed of the horses, the map turning Mongol red. But the empire's most lasting conquest wasn't on land. It was inside the bodies of the conquered. It was in the children taken, in the children killed, and in the children raised to forget where they came from. It was in the way a military strategy became a genetic event, a policy that could outlive the empire itself. By the time the Mongols rode into Khorasan, Zaria's fate wasn't a tragedy of war. It was an administrative routine, a piece of a machine that had already been rolling for a decade, tightening its gears with every city it swallowed. And the only way to understand what happened to her is to follow that machine all the way to its end. What makes that end so unsettling is that, in a way, there wasn't a clean ending at all. Empires usually leave ruins you can point to. Collapsed walls, abandoned palaces, a final battle date in a textbook. But this system Genghis Khan built didn't need a capital to survive. It didn't depend on a single city or a single ruler. It was designed to outlive him. And because it was rooted in reproduction, it kept working even after the armies moved on, even after dynasties fractured, even after the empire itself cracked into rival khanates. In other words, the battlefield never fully closed. Every region the Mongols swept through carried two futures at once. One was visible: the burned cities, the severed trade routes, the sudden shifts of language and law. The other was quieter, moving inside households and family trees. And that future was shaped by women taken from their lives and turned into tools of state. It's important to say that plainly, because history often blurs it into abstraction. The Mongols didn't invent rape in war. That's as old as war itself. What they did, what Genghis Khan did, was turn it into a disciplined, empire-wide system, backed by logistics, medicine, surveillance, and paperwork. That's the leap that changed everything. The consequences weren't only genetic. They were cultural, psychological, social. A conquered city could rebuild its walls. A people could restore a throne. But once children were removed, renamed, and raised to serve the conqueror, the old identity didn't have a safe place to return. The Mongols understood this. That's why the system always paired bloodline control with memory control. You don't just plant a seed, you clear the soil around it so nothing else grows. We can see hints of that in places far beyond Mongolia. Across Central Asia, families still carry oral legends about ancestors who came from the east, about women who disappeared into the steppe and never returned, about children with unfamiliar features who were taken away in the night. The stories aren't always labeled Mongol because time sanded the edges off. But the pattern is there, a wound disguised as folklore. And you can see it in language shifts too. Certain regions that had been Persian or Turkic in identity suddenly began absorbing Mongol terms, not only for warfare or administration, but for kinship and household life. Words for family roles, for inheritance, for tribe. That's one of the telltale signs of intimate conquest, when the vocabulary of home starts changing. Then there's the psychological scar that rarely makes it into the record. Imagine a generation of women forced into a moving prison, carrying children they never chose to bear, watching those children either taken away or killed. Imagine the kind of silence that would settle over communities after that. Not silence because nothing happened. Silence because what happened was too enormous to say. That kind of trauma doesn't vanish. It folds into behavior, into ritual, into fear passed down like a reflex. Some historians argue that this is part of why certain regions that endured prolonged Mongol rule later developed unusually strict controls over women's mobility and sexuality. Not because those societies were naturally that way, but because they had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that women's bodies could become the front line of imperial domination. If control was going to happen anyway, better to keep it inside the community than risk it being seized from outside. That doesn't excuse those systems, but it helps explain them. Trauma doesn't always produce freedom. Sometimes it produces cages made by survivors. For the Mongols, though, the system remained a source of pride. Later chronicles celebrated the vast family of Genghis Khan, the way his descendants filled the ruling class of the empire. His sons and grandsons weren't just heirs. They were proof that the permanent sowing system worked. Each new Khan inherited not only territory and armies, but a biological strategy for keeping conquest alive without constant occupation. And when the empire fractured, the strategy spread into smaller versions of itself. In the Golden Horde, in the Ilkhanate, in the Chagatai Khanate, old Mongol protocols merged with local customs, producing new hierarchies, some less openly systematic, but still rooted in the same logic. Control of women meant control of tomorrow. If you could shape tomorrow, you didn't have to fear rebellion today. This is why the genetic footprints don't fade at the empire's borders. You find that signature line not only in places where the Mongols stayed for generations, but along their routes, their staging grounds, their refueling centers. The caravans were basically moving institutions. Wherever they paused, they left children behind, sometimes raised Mongol, sometimes absorbed into local life, sometimes rejected, sometimes hidden. Either way, a trace remained. When modern researchers mapped that Y chromosome cluster for the first time, the result wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was a confirmation of a historical system that had always been half invisible. It was biology agreeing with horror. And yet, There's a trap in focusing on genetics alone, because it risks turning human suffering into statistics. So let's come back to the people inside the machine. Zarya wasn't a data point. She was a girl pulled from her mother's arms. A girl who learned that silence might be the only way to survive the next hour. A girl whose name the scribes recorded, then replaced with a number. A girl who entered a caravan built to erase her history and harvest her future. We don't know her final chapter. The records are too clean for that. Bureaucracies don't store screams, but we can say what her world would have been like. The march itself would have been a test of endurance. Days of dust, hunger, cold nights. Guards who treated bodies like cargo. Doctors who examined her the way a farmer examines a mare. The ink on her wrist would decide her compartment. Her reproductive value would decide how long she lived. And every time she stepped into a new stage of the process, her world would shrink further, from daughter to captive to unit to womb. If she became pregnant, her baby would not belong to her. Not in name, not in future, not even in burial. If the child looked Mongol, it would be taken. If it didn't, it would die. Either way, her motherhood would be stripped down to function. And if she resisted, she would learn quickly what the system had already practiced for years. Resistance was not met with chaos, but with procedure. The punishment would be planned, public, instructional. This was the part the Mongols never quite predicted. The ways women resisted without leaving a trace the empire could count. The small acts of refusal, the hidden rituals, the whispered songs that carried old names through the dark. The decision to love a child while knowing that love would be punished. The decision to remember anyway. Because even when everything else was stolen, memory could still be fought for. This is why, when archaeologists dig mass graves and find mothers and daughters buried together, the discovery feels like more than science. It feels like a message that slipped past the empire. Proof that bonds survived long enough to be laid side by side, even if only at the end. So what do we do with this history now? We don't tell it to glorify an empire that grew on terror. We don't tell it to reduce suffering into a headline about 16 million descendants. We tell it because it forces us to see conquest differently. It reminds us that power doesn't always announce itself with banners and battles. Sometimes the deepest kind of power is quiet, hidden in policy, in bodies, in the long curve of generations. It reminds us that war isn't only about land. It's about who gets to shape the future and at what cost. And it leaves us with a final, uncomfortable truth. The Mongol Empire is gone. The Khanates collapsed, the cities rebuilt, the banners rotted. But the people born out of that system are still here, millions of them. Living proof that a strategy of violence can stretch centuries beyond its creator. That's the lasting architecture Genghis Khan built. Not only an empire of horsemen, but an empire of inheritance. And somewhere inside that inheritance, inside the bone and blood of Eurasia, there are still echoes of girls like Zarya, whose lives were swallowed into a machine, and whose stories survive now only in the traces they could not erase.